Hi everyone, we're here this week at Mutant Watts, and this is a really special show. I'm really excited about this. We have three marvelous guests. We have Dani Kinney, who is there, and who works writing for Women Write About Comics, and also the sensitivity reader and like consulting of creative work. And well, she's amazing, and I can't recommend enough all the essays. And also we have Rabiroff, which is right here in the middle, and who writes for ComicsXF, before it was called Savior Files, and who did some pretty amazing essays, which I think we're gonna touch on those themes today too. And we have again Rhayne from Carefree Black Nerd, or very special, very ever returning guest. And he has a podcast about representation in comics that is pretty cool, and he touches on like everything that's going on and everything related to the TV series or wherever. So just like hit that podcast up. Also, recently he opened a YouTube channel that has like some videos too. So like check that out too. And aside from that, we have some of the usuals. I'm Duna, I'm the host, and we have Gabriel Ryler here and Travis. And we're very excited to talk about you all today, about identity and reading X-Men. And we come from very different perspectives, so there's gonna be like a broad thing. We encourage everyone to like make comments and talk about their own experience as they watch or what they feel with what we say. And I'm gonna stay attentive to that. So without further ado, let's kick it.
This week on Mutant Watch.
So yay, here we are. Before we start the show, I want to make a little disclaimer. You all will watch it. If you're watching from Twitter, you're not going to watch it like in text. So I'm going to remind people when we go to more triggering themes. But if you are watching on YouTube or Facebook, you're going to watch more or less whatever we want to talk about today. But I'm going to name some of the things, some of the themes that we're going to talk about. And if you like are not feeling like hearing about these themes, I recommend clearly that you come back later and listen to us. And some of them are, you're going to talk about transphobia, we're going to talk about anti-trans violence and transpanic violence, about racism, about anti-Semitic violence, and we're going to talk about also anti-blackness, erasure of cultures, race, skin colors, and complexions. And we're going to talk about other themes, including depression, anxiety, self-harm, suicide, and childhood trauma, ableism, and some portrayals of mental illness, and sexual assault, misogyny, and a little bit into the sexualization of teenager characters and queer coding. And I think that's mostly all the triggers we're going to talk about today. Oh, and I don't know how to pronounce this in English. Bullying. Okay, bullying. That also. And those are some things that we're going to talk when talking about identity. I'm going to try to when we bring some of those things, remember a little bit people, but you all do what you can. Like, okay, so for starting to think about this question about identity, which is something that I feel like brings a lot of feelings to the things that we see in the pages and to how we view them. I'm gonna ask every one of our guests to like tell us how they relate to reading X-Men comics, what drives you towards them, what drives you to read them from the perspective of your identity. And we're gonna all answer that question in the order you all prefer. Who wants to go first?
Well, for me, it's been a wild ride. I can remember as far as the cartoon in '92, the X-Men cartoon. Before then, I was getting books just because they were like 10 cents, and I could just buy them with my own money. Once I got older and representation started to be more at the forefront of my mind, not just adults telling me like, oh, you need to look at this or you need to look at that. I started to notice that I didn't see a lot of myself in comics. So I read what I enjoyed, but the older I got, it was more or less like seeking out, be it indie, be it DC, be it Marvel. But that really does inform my decision even today. I'm like fully grown. And if there's not a brown person somewhere in the book, on the cover, in the creative team, there's books that I'll still pick up because I like the characters or I like the story that I've seen so far, but that really influences my decision. If I go into a comic shop and like there's 400 Superman books, 600 Captain America, and then there's this one, I don't know, Storm one shot, it frustrates me, but that does guide my initial picks. And then everything after that is kind of like weighing your options of what do you enjoy, even though you're probably not going to see yourself in a lot of the books that you pick up.
I'll take a stab at that question next. I think. I mean, I have a very similar experience, like most people my age, where X-Men came to me through the television show first, and so I think even before I was able to kind of identify and articulate the things inside of myself that I now connect so much with the experience of the X-Men and mutants in general, there is a very clear sense structurally in those stories where, mutant identity is itself like mutant bodies are inherently politicized in the same way that, a lot of bodies of marginalized people and people from marginalized intersections have inherently politicized bodies. And, as a trans person, my body is inherently tethered to society's expectations, and there's no opportunity for me to depoliticize my own body. It's and it's something that comics really, outside of the X-Men, I just don't see. And I'd always been reading. I was like a really big Green Arrow fan for a long time. I was really kind of desperately echolocating in comics to find something that felt analogous to what it was that I was navigating internally. And, I came into my own identity around the same time as the Utopia era of X-Men was really starting to kind of flesh out. And so like a lot of baby egg trans folks, I went through this kind of like queer separatism, like ideological wave where I was just like, yeah, like fucking who needs the cishet society? Like detach from it entirely, form something of our own. And it's, that kind of aspect of radical community building became so inherent to the way I like implicitly conceive of the X-Men. And so, I can never separate that from my interpretation of the X-Men. It's why like every time I write something, it's about the trans lens being applied to the X-Men because, and I feel like this is true of a lot of folks from marginalized communities. There's no way to see anything outside of our experiences. I approach every story as a trans story because that's the lens that I see my life through. And so there's no way for me to ever untether those things. And I think in recent years, seeing the X-Men line really commit to that level of subtext and taking it into something that is textual as well in a lot of cases, maybe not as many as I'd like, has been something that I continue to enjoy. And so, I've at this point moved into saying that I'm not really a comics fan. I'm just an X-Men fan because I find that there's so little of a market for stories about me, even within the X-Men books, but the X-Men really gets at something deeply challenging and difficult about the way I navigate society, and I've always been drawn to them as a result.
So the lens that I come to this from is that I'm Jewish, and I grew up in a Jewish family that was really not all that far removed from a very immediate story of trauma and tragedy in Europe. My maternal grandpa had come over with his parents from Europe. And as a result of that, every story that I've ever heard or read or seen about fighting against injustice or fighting for something is inseparable from the political lens of how we engage with our society. Because that shadow has always been over the way that I've engaged with society, because that's how I've grown up in my family. And so there is a sense that because of our history and because of our identity, we are obligated to take a stand for social justice as a community. And that's something that even before I recognized it overtly, I saw in X-Men implicitly. And I knew that from the beginning of engaging with X-Men through the animated series and then through the comics that I forced my parents to buy in the early 90s, because it's there. Because the X-Men, in a way that other comic characters historically have not been, are outsiders against the world trying to build something better. And they're not just fighting villains because they're villains. They're fighting villains because they are trying to construct a society that will not produce that kind of evil and oppression and villainy in the world. And that's something that I don't think I ever saw in comics, certainly mainstream comics, outside of the X-Men when I was growing up. And I think it allowed the franchise to connect with me in a really profound way that sort of put a stamp down to today.
So, I mean, for me, I came to comics first. I am a 5th generation out of 6 generations now of a comics reading family. So I grew up, you had comics around, I mean, in a way more than you had TV, because I remember back in the day, like, you were lucky if you had 2 channels and somebody nearby had cable or something. And so I came in through the comics. I came into X-Men comics through Defenders, because Defenders back in the day had, 3 of the 5 founding X-Men in it for X Factor. And so I kind of followed them into X Factor then and into Uncanny around that time, rather than coming from, so the cartoon still feels very new to me in a weird way. Like, I know it was a long time ago and I was still a kid, but in my head, it's like, that's a new thing that came in and one day I'll catch up on it. So it was really comics focused, and it was really about anytime, whatever I was going through, whatever was happening, there was something going on with the X-Men. And this was the 80s. AIM was still very strong in the 80s, and there was a lot of talk about, that we were being genocided. And I remember as a kid, like, I can't have kids. So, I'm out of it. But as a kid, we always got the talk of, it's going to be up to you. Have as many kids as you can, because we're all going to die. We're all going to die out. And that's kind of, native existence in, in North America. And so it felt very familiar that way, that they were constantly under this implicit threat. Even if the Sentinels don't come and knock down the roof of the school, or even if Magneto doesn't do something, there's still a chance that they're just going to die out. There may not be no more mutants. So that was kind of my early intro into it.
I guess I'll go next. So my introduction to the X-Men actually came before I realized that I was queer. And it came in a time of my life where I had a lot of internalized racism that I didn't realize at that age. But despite all of that, I always felt separate from everyone as a teenager when I came across the X-Men. So my introduction to the world of X was Generation X, where that theme of being an outsider is so crucial to every part of it. A lot of my social life as a kid, there was a lot of people who had various undiagnosed mental health issues. And there was this overwhelming sense that we couldn't go to adults, that they not only would not understand, but that we couldn't trust them with that kind of information. And then being able to connect with a comic, in which case it's essentially just the kids. Yeah, Emma Frost and Banshee are there, but it's mostly the kids dealing with the kids' stuff. And it was something that I didn't know at the time that I related to so well, of this kind of like found family trope where they built each other up, and it was something that I could see in my life. And as we talk later, I'll explain about how the various different arcs kind of helped correspond with my own identity development, and how it kind of helped assist me and helped me change the way I look at the X-Men as a comics as a whole. But as far as getting in, that sense of being an outsider but still finding a place where you belong and building it, it really resonated with me in a way I couldn't understand at the time.
So it's my turn. Well, I'm not sure if I would have ended up being as much of a big X-Men fan as I am now if I hadn't started with New Mutants, which was the first thing I read. And I was a very like traumatized child. I also didn't have many friends. I was being very severely bullied. And also I didn't know I was queer too. And that's the moment in my life where New Mutants came to my life. And I feel like I related a lot to the trauma a lot of these characters were going through, and I was like longing for the type of friendship they created, which I feel like it's something that later in my life I have seen develop more with my friends. Like something for me about New Mutants that really, really drove me in was that they bonded over that mutanthood, which was something that I feel like I have done later with other queer friends when I have known more of that about myself, like talking about our childhoods and like, you know, there's even panels of them that are literally talking about what they went through, like these long 80 panels that have like a lot of dialogue in them. It's like describing what their life was, and that's something that really made me feel less lonely. So that's how I entered the X-Men, and I don't feel like I would have been as big of a fan, because I'm a big fan and I love the mutant metaphor and all of that, but also I'm like very critical of big companies, so I always prefer to buy indie comics. I'm more drawn to that always. But I can't help but have this tied up to my experience as a child, to how I felt with those comics in that moment, and how it made me feel less alone, and they made me feel understood in how I felt. And I feel like if not for what my life has been, I couldn't ever have read those comics. So that's big for me. Like my identity was big in that. I will also talk more on this show about the nuances of that, because I feel that there was some part that was great and some part that was not very healthy, and I feel like both are important, especially for like reading what the comics, where they're going, and because we are the people that are like watching that unfold. So that would be me. And before we get into heavier topics, I had the idea of trying to introduce for people that are watching the show and etc. A kind of a small talk about the different eras of the X-Men and how they can relate to identity issues. I don't know if anyone has like something very clear about, for example, these 60s X-Men. I don't have anything clear to talk about that. But we can like go chronologically. This could be like more lightly than later.
Yeah.
tell Gabriel. Oh, go.
I don't know if I don't want to jump over anyone if you guys have anything to say about the early era, but what sticks out to me is the lack of diverse identity for so long. And I don't know if it's just me being born after the fact that I don't connect to those early issues, but I can't seem to care about the characters or the stories, and there's just that it's 5 white cis at the time straight people, and it doesn't have those themes that you find, or at least that I can see, that you find later on, of being the outsider in as vividly as you get later on. And I think that lack of diverse identities is why I always dread any time I have to go back and look at those issues.
So I'm going to give that a yes, however. So first of all, you're 100% right. And obviously the first thing that everybody notices when they read those early issues today is, wow, this is a bunch of good looking white people in a giant house together. Like this is the most fortunate group of privileged Americans that has ever been put on a single superhero team. That said, the original concept of the X-Men, it was almost certainly based on a novel called Children of the Atom by a woman named Wilmar Shiras. But as constructed by Jack Kirby, who was really borderline obsessed with this notion of mutants for a number of years, going back to the 50s, and then in partnership with Stan Lee, it's very much set up as a metaphor for post-war American Judaism.
Yeah.
And it plays off of what are some frankly anti-Semitic stereotypes that had historically been used against Jews and were being used against Jews at the time. These people with special powers that could be anywhere in society, they are more powerful than you. They might be smarter than you. They might be able to do things to you that you don't know what they will mean. And so you have to hunt them down and try to seek them out. And the only thing they can do is to try and take refuge with each other in this school for mutual protection and to find other people like them, because they're the only ones who have the ability to find the other people like them. They're the only ones who can really suss that out and bring them into the community. I don't think Stan Lee was ever overtly aware of that. I think Jack Kirby might have been, but certainly it's all over those issues. And so as white as the characters are, as privileged and wealthy as the characters are, there is nevertheless a minority subtext that's overlaid over all of those issues. And it doesn't really come out until that Sentinel 3-parter. It's the only time in that early run where you finally get the sense of, oh, I see what they're playing with. I see what's happening here. And then they never really get a chance to explore it until that's picked up significantly later by other writers. But it's there. And I think it provides a springboard for what the X-Men eventually would end up becoming.
Well, I mean, for me, I'm really struck by early Magneto. And I know a lot of fans hate that early Magneto, which is Jack Kirby's Magneto, because he carries it to other titles as well. But when you look at those issues, his human soldiers, and he's hiring human soldiers, they dress in Nazi uniforms to invade other countries. They go to peaceful countries in South America. They go to the Savage Land. And what they're doing in those issues is, strict colonization. It's conquest. Magneto's after weapons. He's after gold. He is making slaves frequently when Magneto goes places. That's the agenda. And I think those politics really resonate with me, that's what this school was set up to oppose, but also to try to outreach and convince people, because they're not trying to get everybody to join the X-Men. Some people, they're just trying to tell them, don't go to Magneto's side. Don't go be part of this army. And so that resonates with me a lot. And I think had, some more resonance then for certain audiences.
Mm-hmm.
They go as far as they could have? No. And there are other titles like Doom Patrol, which was very similar to X-Men in a lot of ways, a lot more political at the exact same time. And when Arnold Drake leaves Doom Patrol to write for X-Men, his X-Men starts to get a little more political. So that part of it really does, the early issues resonates with me a lot more than the original 5 X-Men in the house with their teacher.
I mean, as far as this is jumping ahead chronologically, probably by about a mile, so I apologize. But I think, you know, the X-Men, it's really interesting because, like Zach articulated, there's really something structurally there that is already. The mutant narrative is set up to work as the sort of painted over representation of the experiences of marginalized communities. And for the longest time, it was done so while not explicitly representing those identities or experiences. And I think, you know, I will honestly say I rarely go back to read comics before the 80s in general. Partially because to me, it is quite literally a form of like self-harm. Like I can guarantee there will be really unnerving levels of cisnormativity, of reductive framings of gender and sexuality. And it's not really until, I mean, I would say that even still, it could really stand to be improved. But when I felt like I started to notice a marked improvement of those things was around the Mutant Revolution era, which I think Bendis's Uncanny, if I'm remembering correctly, was when I really started to find the threads that I was really enjoying in the sort of way that they were articulating a sort of broader mutant politic. They were starting to articulate, you know, they were basically responsive to the fact that being mutants meant that they were inherently politicized. And it was sort of it was the first time I really had seen the comics, you know, just as a reader, not that it's the first time that it had happened in the books, but it was the first time that in reading the books, I encountered a story where, you know, the mutants had finally said, okay, to hell with it. If you're going to politicize us, we are going to essentially create a political faction of our own. We are going to define ourselves along the same political lines that you're forcing us to be defined by, but in such a way that overtly challenges those things. And I think, you know, there are many stories along the way that I've gone back to and read through that I've found that to be an immensely complex part of the narrative. I think Days of Future Past is a story that I have always had a warm place in my heart for. Even just sort of like the Days of Future Past proper, not even looking at like Days of Future Present and all of the really, really interesting stuff with Rachel and Franklin that comes out of it, which I also recommend reading. But, you know, growing up trans in America really does feel like, you know, like when I leave my house, I have to constantly think, where am I going? Who will I be interacting with? What part of, you know, the suburbs am I going to? How am I dressed? I have to think to myself, and to, you know, kind of to map this to the mutant experience, do I look like a mutant? Do I pass at this moment? Do I feel like what I'm doing with my body is making me safer or more dangerous? And that's something that for me has always felt really in the forefront of the Days of Future Past storyline. They live in this world where, you know, we see in the beginning, Kate Pride is being chased down. We don't know how long Kate's been outside for, but we know that the first time we see Kate is being chased down, and it has that like sense of urgency and that sense of threat that I think it's a very grim story, but it also hits on something that I think a lot of folks from marginalized communities can relate to, which is the fact that navigating society can be an incredibly hostile experience for us. And it can be, you know, something that feels entirely mundane, like going around the corner to get some milk or something, can feel threatening and dangerous and scary. And I think, to kind of draw a line to where we are now, I'm really excited to, you know, I bounced off of X-Men comics for a very long time. And I came back on when Hoxpox was starting up, because it was clear that they were going to start doing something with the mutant politic that really hadn't been explored anymore, which is, what if we stop mining these stories for their capacity to convey trauma? And I think, you know, where we're at now, I'm really excited to see how they've taken this kind of heavily socialistic, almost anarchistic model of society building and continued to ideate on that and continue to show like what radical community building can be. And I think the current era of X-Men comics is definitely my favorite for a lot of reasons, but that is probably the biggest reason is, A, there are people that are like me. There are trans people in these comics now, thanks to Vita Ayala. And they are normal, and they are safe, and they are happy, and they are with their kin. They're not being inherently threatened by an unfriendly world. And I think I'm excited to see where that goes. And I would hesitate to say that I think there is a historical precedent before Hoxpox for that type of experience being shown.
I guess I would disagree, and I wish I believed that the Hoxpox, the current era, was socialist and anarchist. And it's not. It's feudalistic. It's isolationist. It is overly masculine and misogynist in the end of it. They use the word man to represent all people. That's not a common phrase anymore. None of us use that daily in our life. None of us when we speak of people, we don't say man, but that is the received language of Krakoa. That's how they talk. And so I really get sick with a lot of the current X-Men comics. They have their own CIA. They had their own CIA before they had their own welfare system. That's disturbing to me. That's writers, and I'm not blaming every single writer, because there's one particular writer running the show right now, a writer who has a history of these things. If you go back to Hickman's Fantastic Four, where he promotes eugenics as a reasonable idea, the most intelligent man in the world, Reed Richards, and he's writing these Reed Richards and this Council of Reeds, and they fully buy on to genetic evil. That sort of stuff is disturbing to me. So, I have a book coming out with Comic Watch, serializing. First chapter is on Monday, dealing with earlier X-Men runs. And I think we did see in some earlier X-Men runs, like the Grant Morrison era, that to me was a very socialist-minded era, in that what they were trying to establish at the school by giving everyone, including the children, the vote and equal participation and equal choice in their lives, that comes closer to socialism to me than Krakoa, which seems very regressive.
I want to hop in on this because I feel like this thing with Krakoa and having like a lot of good stuff and some stuff that is has happened before, because I feel like with the Claremont and Simonson runs, I feel like a lot of what Dani has talked about, the presenting in Days of Future Past, presenting in Genosa, presenting in other storylines, things that were really not in comics at all, that were not thought before, that were like way more political than a lot of comics. But still, there was some part of it that was really, like, for example, for me, holding me back was all the queer coding, more like they couldn't show queer characters, so they saw a lot of subtext, but it turns out as sometimes sexualizing even characters that are teenagers, sometimes, like, one of the first scenes that is queer with Kitty Pryde, with Kate, is her with a very much older woman. And it's shown in like BDSM stuff, and I feel like that's something that can happen a lot in comics. Like there's some part of it, some idea of it that is really touching into some issues that are really important, but there's also some stuff that is dragging. I don't know how you all feel about that, but I feel like, for example, the Decimation era for me had something similar, because in one way it was very important seeing like mutants coming together after something as difficult as the Decimation. But in other ways, I was like, this works as a construct for placing all the blame in the war into a Romani woman.
Mm.
And it really fed into that. And so on one hand, you had like very incredible sweet stories about mutant relating to each other and also like trying to form a community after trauma. And on the other hand, you have like all of this going into Wanda's shoulders. And in other comics, there's a lot more of compassion for Wanda than in X-Men comics in that era. And I feel like that's something that happens a lot. Like there's a lot of tension with trying to portray a perfect political picture. Like that's just, I think, that impossible to do. But I don't know what you all feel about this.
So one thing that I find kind of exactly what you were saying, and kind of going back to what Danny and Travis were saying about the Krakoa era, and even me and Zach disagreeing with the original X-Men, it boils down to what the topic of the show is that we're reading the X-Men through our own cultural lens, and it's making us form these different opinions. Me and Duna have had many conversations off the show about how, with me being a New York City kid and where Duna grew up, we have completely different background knowledge on the Romani people. So where she was able to pick up on all of this kind of racist blame being placed on Wanda, I had no idea about any of these stereotypes until I started conversing with Duna about it. So my read-through of Decimation was something completely different. To me, Decimation is a story about survival, about people being pushed to the absolute edge. And this is one of those trigger moments. Beginning of X Factor, there is a suicide attempt. And Richter jumps. He is pushed so far that he just cannot stand being alive anymore, and he tries to kill himself. And if it wasn't for the intervention of Siren and the rest of X Factor, he would have died. And then X Factor kind of, and the rest of the Decimation Shadows for that matter as well, ends up becoming this story about even when life is just beating the living crap out of you, that there is a way to find a way to survive. And like I shared earlier with my own experience with mental health, that was a story that I zeroed in on. And that was my cultural lens or my experience lens for reading Decimation and getting that completely different reading than what Duna was saying, because I was bringing my own stuff to the table. So for me, it was such a survival tale, a trauma tale, a recovery tale, and kind of building those supports.
Okay. I'd like to add my 2 cents. I think I'm in a kind of peculiar situation because everything that everyone has said, I have some level of agreements with. For me, consuming media, be it TV, books, or whatever, it's always been pretty white. And so when I go back and I read an X-Men comic from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and whatever, I am already conditioned from childhood just watching sitcoms to just enjoy the story that I'm given. So a lot of what you guys have said today has actually opened up my own, I guess, understanding, for lack of a better word, to things that have been happening right in front of me. Because I have been looking at Jean Grey's and Scott Summers my whole life, where it's like, oh, this is interesting. Dark Phoenix, sure, this happens. And so I was able to kind of put myself into these different stories. It wasn't until it got to like the queer awakening, I'll say, that I started to really gravitate towards Generation X. That was my X-Men. That's my core, because that was the first time as a kid I saw Everett Thomas, I saw Monet, I saw Jubilee, I saw this diverse, even Jonathan being a British child. I hadn't seen that on TV. I hadn't read that in books. And so to get this book where I've been enjoying mutants forever and a day, but I'm finally starting to feel as if this is something that maybe is speaking directly to me. I don't know. I'm still in awe because again, you all have said things, especially with different runs that I've just read at face value of being, oh, this is just an entertaining comic. And because for me, I saw myself in so many other things that family would have given me, like photo albums, books, different documentaries and whatnot, that when I came to X-Men, it was like, this is an interesting story. Yes, this is 5 white kids at a mansion, but you can just enjoy it for what it is. So this, as much as I'm excited to be here, it's almost like I'm learning as well. So, thanks for that. But my view of the X-Men throughout the years until Generation X was honestly just enjoying this property, knowing what people are saying it's supposed to be, but not really seeing myself with the few bishops and storms that we get here and there. It's just like, oh, this is just entertaining. So that's kind of where I am. So. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to take advantage of this what Rhayne said, to ask you all how you feel about something that happens a lot with these books, that is the metaphoric representation, like trying to represent oppressed things that happens to people in real life through the mutant metaphor, versus when we have explicit representation, which I think so. All of you will have some example or something that you feel like could talk more about how these things can intertwine, or how they haven't intertwined or have intertwined.
I am, and I get that this makes me odd among the X-Men fans, I'm not a huge fan of the mutant metaphor and the way it is pushed, particularly now. I feel like we are at a stage where it's 2021. I feel like we should be getting more stuff done explicitly. If we're gonna continue with the mutant metaphor, it needs to become an issue about intersectionality. Okay, so yes, mutants are persecuted, but how does that react to the mutants of color? How does it react to queer mutants? And I like that you said the word queer awakening, Rhayne, because for me, that was Richter and Shatterstar. Richter is a Mexican queer character, and when he came out in X-Men 45, it was like a light bulb went off, and I realized that why are we not having these explicit conversations in these comics? Is it just that now in 2009 that I'm able to look at an X-Men comic and really feel like there's somewhat that it's me, that I can see myself in that comic, and I've never saw that before. And it wasn't until then, in 2009, that I really realized that my stories deserve to be told as well. And I think that we went through so long of the comics where that was only told through subtext. It angers me in hindsight. And I get that, like in the 60s, the 70s, they probably couldn't do that. Well, they definitely couldn't do that. But we're not in that time anymore. And I feel like there is not enough explicit representation in the X-Men in general. And I think that is very disappointing when they kind of cash in on the mutant metaphor as much as they do.
So I think that's not an uncommon opinion, and it's something that, to a large extent I do share. And I think, we very, very much do need increased and broader and deeper representation in X-Men, in comics, in media generally, because the metaphor isn't going to do the job on its own. And if you allow mutancy to stand in as a substitute for marginalized identity, for minority identity, for identities that might be different from the majority of readers who are buying the comic, then you're doing a disservice to them and you're doing a disservice to the people that you're ostensibly representing through the metaphor. That all being said, I don't think that the metaphor is completely irrelevant, and I don't think that it's completely without a purpose. I think that it does do more than simply act as a stand-in for marginalized identity when creators aren't able or aren't willing to use that identity overtly. I think, I think of an interview that Matt Fraction once did where he was talking about this, and this was while he was writing X-Men, and they were asking him about what purpose the mutant metaphor served. And he talked about the episode of The Twilight Zone, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, which has gone down as one of the absolute classic episodes of it. And he said, if Rod Serling had called that episode The People of Color Are Due on Maple Street, then we would look back on it and say, okay, that was probably really powerful at the time, but now it seems like the most dated kind of 1950s agitprop, the most unenduring kind of well-meaning white liberal attempts to grapple with the issues of his society. But by creating a metaphor, by turning that political issue into a metaphor, it makes it timeless and it universalizes it in a way that gives it a kind of transcendent power that just explicitly representing an identity doesn't have. So I don't think it should be either or. I think it can't be either or. And there's always going to be a little bit of a push-pull between representing things directly and representing them through metaphor and through storytelling. But I think that when you get those two to work together in a balance, you can create something much, much more powerful than you otherwise would.
Yeah, I mean, I think with trans characters, it's a particularly interesting situation where, up until a month ago, there was really only one explicitly trans character, Jessie Drake, and she exists in 2 issues of a Marvel Presents tie-in. And I've written about the issue, and the most common thing I keep finding myself thinking is, for the longest time, it was all there was, and it was really bad. It was really bad because it's so inherently tied to trauma, and to trauma that specifically afflicts trans people and trans youth. I mean, I was working through writing on the issue while the Trump administration was trying to put through redefinitions of protections for trans people in homeless shelters. And so much of the story of Jessie Drake hinges on the fact that she is misgendered and outed in a homeless shelter and policed based on her gender and abandoned by the shelter and by Typhoid Mary because of her gender identity. And she is subjected to an experience that is all too common. And it is so rooted in forming a story about being trans that is only understood as traumatic in a way that, is so hard to look at. But at the same time, it's also real. And I think that that's so much of what trans representation has always been. And if you want to see a really good documentary on that, I would recommend Disclosure. I think it's still on Netflix. And it articulates the fact that historically trans representation has always been god awful. Even some of the best stories about us are just so tied to our pain, to our trauma, but they're also real. And I think, one character out of 60 years of comics is really rough. And, to Zach's point, I take more from the aspects of the mutant metaphor as they've come up over the years in terms of looking at trans stories than I have from the explicit trans character that existed. And I think, yes, the mutant metaphor is imperfect. And if there are people out there who think that the mutant metaphor is perfect for any any one marginalized identity's experience, I bless you. because you're having a lot more fun than I am. Like, the mutant metaphor is inherently flawed, but it's not supposed to be perfect. The mutant metaphor, and I think that the most interesting disconnects are where the mutant metaphor breaks down, and I think that those are the moments that I'm the most interested in, specifically because when I look back at Claremont is reading a lot of the queer theory that serves as the sort of preceding text to trans theory. You know, Claremont was a really big Judith Butler fan, and that's in the text, and it structurally informs the way he's conceiving of the mutant metaphor. And so, as a trans person, I might not have always been able to find characters that have my identity, but I was always able to at least find characters that had my experience. That, you know, maybe this is not explicitly a trans story, but it unearths something that maybe is almost easier to describe through the metaphor. And I think, you know, one of the most recent iterations of that, two recent iterations of that, was Vita Ayala's New Mutants 15, which, you know, I plan to use that issue as a way to describe the complexity of dysphoria within the trans community. Because even within the trans community, there are hundreds of varying concepts of bodily autonomy, and they are all in conflict. And it's something that if you try to talk about that explicitly in the comic would just be so hard, but you can make the experience of marginalized communities so much more easy to understand from the outside. And I think Miles from J. Miles Explain the X-Men coined a phrase called the paper window, which is to like sort of look into somebody else's experience. And that's when I have found the mutant metaphor to be really helpful. I mean, you know, Franklin Richards in the Fantastic Four X-Men story is another touch point where, you know, this really complex experience of being a cis parent to a trans child can be incredibly hard to like communicate the complexity and the ways that caregiving can become gatekeeping and harm. And the first issue of that series does an excellent job at unearthing so many of those complexities and using the metaphor to make it palatable, to make it a common language. You know, I think in a lot of ways, the mutant metaphor has become almost a lingua franca to communicate the experiences of marginalized communities, because you can almost learn more through the metaphor sometimes than I can explicitly talking about it, because the mutant metaphor is ubiquitous at this point. It is something that kind of structurally is understood in the zeitgeist of, you know, at least pop culture fandom. You know, there's nobody who's going to hear the X-Men and not have at least a rough idea of what that experience is structurally. But, you know, to circle back, that doesn't excuse the fact that explicit representation just hasn't existed. And I think, to everyone's point, like, there just needs to be more stories about explicit representation, which will make the metaphor have to do less heavy lifting. Like, if we can tell stories about marginalized communities without the metaphor, and we can tell them explicitly, the metaphor doesn't have to work as hard then. And we can, like, I mean, I even will admit this. Sometimes we put a lot of pressure on the metaphor to operate in that way because we need it to, because there is no explicit representation to do that work for us. And I think, you know, even right now, comics got to do better. Like, a majority of the mainline titles are boasting largely white, largely heterosexual, and almost entirely cisgendered casts. And that's, you know, it's 2021. Like, it's gross. It's really it's a sad point about the fact, like, one of my favorite eras of comics is also still reenacting the same forms of, you know, white supremacy and cisnormativity that comics 30 years ago were perpetuating. And there's really no excuse. And we've seen, you know, we've seen victories in inches alone in the past 10 years, and I would love to see that expedited.
I like the metaphor. No, but I agree wholeheartedly that there things that need to be improved. I like what you said about explicitly telling stories so that the metaphor doesn't have to work as hard. And I like that mainly because of retcons. There's so many things that were subtext before decades ago that are now able to, in this current time, be explicitly said. A character can be queer. A character can love this way out loud. And for those of us in the know, we can say, oh, you could read that in, X-Men 42 back from 19, whatever. So I do think that there needs to be some active balance. And I honestly feel like there needs to be more care taken with comics in general, but specifically X-Men. When we have Dawn of X, and then next, let's say we're going to have, I don't know, X-Men in space. When you have the ability to set out years worth of events and years worth of comics and get different creative teams, I think more care needs to be taken into the creative teams themselves, because you see a difference when you have people behind the scenes representing the people on panel or on screen. So I say I like the idea of just having the metaphor there general, but I also like this idea of give me an arc where there is an explicit story being told. There's other stuff going on, making an entertaining comic. And again, we're in 2021. There's no excuse why this can't be done outside of maybe company mandating whatever. And even that's a bigger problem. So, like you said, I think I like the metaphor. I do like it because I think it makes things better for generations later on. But I feel like there needs to be those hard stories written, drawn, infused with the culture of these people, because again, to bring race back into it, as a kid I thought Richter was white. I've only, like, when I see the color on page and you're not, I think sometimes you need those cues for other people, to be it a style of dress, a choice of language. For me, the characters were just, they were either black or they were white. And then you might even say, oh, this character is a Mexican character. And I know Dani, I knew she wasn't white, but even with her coloring and with the way she was handled and other characters of color, for me, this little black boy from the Midwest who has white classmates and Mexican classmates and black classmates, there was no cues for me to pick up on. So I think overall, the metaphor is great, but there still needs to be something hard, fast, in your face. This is exactly what it is. And then kind of play off that, so that, like you said, the metaphor doesn't have to do as much heavy lifting as it has been doing forever and a day.
So a few things come to mind right away, one of which is, where I really first saw what felt like seeing myself in X-Men comics specifically was Larry Hama. And Larry Hama is like an atom bomb, because Larry Hama suddenly, there's probably more black characters, Asian characters, native characters in Hama's work than there is in all of Claremont. And Claremont wrote a whole lot more. But Claremont would do things like with Tom Corsi and, was her name Sharon Friedlander or Friedland?
Friedlander.
Two white characters who he's like, now they're magic Indians. And they have a tan, and they're going to start, and they start wearing headbands and feathers and shit. And there's still two white people that he just gave a tan to, but they're going to dress somehow now, and that's the representation. When Jim Lee asked for more Asian characters in X-Men, what Claremont, pitched was the change in Betsy, where she's going to become Asian. What had been asked for was, can we have more Asian characters in the book I'm drawing? And so that to me is the problem with the mutant metaphor, is I like the mutant metaphor when it's about recognizing yourself in other people. When it's about community, recognizing community, that's positive, that's great. When it's about other people being afraid of mutants, the mutants have powers. It goes back to those sort of, like when I was a kid and they had those super predator ideas that the government would talk about, and the gangs now are full of like superhuman, non-white criminals. And that's what it feels like. It doesn't feel like, well, they're afraid of them for no reason or because they're different. They're afraid of them because they legitimately have dangerous abilities that real minorities don't have. That's not happening. But at the same time, it's not just X-Men comics. It's all comics. DC had a Valentine's Day special last month, and it's like 60, 70 pages long. It's a big book. And there's like 2 kisses, and they're forehead kisses. It's 2021. It's a Valentine's Day special, and they're so afraid of kissing that nearly every story is about these sort of sitcom heterosexual antagonisms or queer people who at best, when they're old and dying, can kiss someone on the forehead. And so it's not just X-Men. Comics, American superhero comics right now. We saw it with Phil Jimenez the other day saying that when he did Superwoman, he was asked to make it more palatable to Trumpites and to Trump followers. And that's where we're at. I think the companies are chasing this very centrist, very careful idea that doesn't really exist. That market doesn't really exist. But that's where we're stuck pursuing.
I want to circle this back because I feel like this is a good moment to talk about the author's responsibility. But before I go into that part, I want to talk about the ways in which the metaphor, which I think can be good for a lot of things, can also be harmful. Travis already talked about that a little bit, and I think I can add that in my experience as a mentally ill person, the most dangerous mutants are almost all mentally ill. Are Legion, are Typhoid Mary, who wasn't a mutant but became a mutant to be like a bad mutant because there was no justification for like bad mutants, so she had to fill that role in a run. And also like Shadow King is implied to be mentally ill too. And of course, Wanda, which Dani has a great article about something that really like bad that happened not so long ago with Dan Slott writing Franklin Richards very poorly and using the metaphor extremely bad. And I feel that's very likely what happened with Wanda in House of M. But instead of being a child wanting to be special, this was a bipolar woman having a breakdown. And that was the moment in which the mutant metaphor like crows for Wanda. Like, you're not mutant anymore because you had a breakdown and it was revealed that you want. And I feel like that's a way in which these metaphors can be dangerous, is when the people that are writing behind it are thinking about these characters being dangerous, really. And they can't put that forward with the metaphor because that would be like, I'm justified to be bigoted, and that doesn't make sense. But they put it forward in other ways. They unmake mutants. They make mutants especially dangerous because they're not really a mutant. They're like a psychic presence with the Shadow King. Or they make mutants dangerous because they like swallow people in. And I feel like that's a way in which it shows that sometimes the metaphor like overexceeds what it tried to do and becomes like clearly something like where people put their own prejudice in. And I feel like that's something really that can happen in these books, has happened before, is going to happen in the future probably. But we need to find a way to like not let that happen, to not let, for example, took this character who is a bipolar Romani woman and be like, yeah, this character is actually not a mutant, she was faking, and she's going to like cause something like the end of the world. Because that really, really plays into the metaphor in the bad way. Not in the, like, it crosses with real life stuff. And a lot of people don't see that when they read the comic. They don't see Wanda either as bipolar or as Romani. None of the two. They only see what they're telling them in the other side. But the message arrives anyway. And to circle back that into the sensitivity reading and stuff. I know Dani has a lot of has experience with that, with sensitivity reading, and I feel like that's something that we could talk about in this regards, like how can stories be made in a way that is respectful, still using the metaphor. And I don't know what you all think about all of this.
Yeah, I think, I mean, nobody will be shocked by my answer to this. I bounced off of the X-Men comics really hard during the Rosenberg run for one particular reason. First off, to shout out to my editor, Nola. Nola has an amazing 2 pieces actually on Uncanny X-Men 17 by Matthew Rosenberg, specifically spoiler warning and content warning here, talking about spoilers for Matthew Rosenberg's run and talking about anti-trans violence. Rosenberg tells a story about Rhayne, a mutant, who is kind of in a scene where basically people are flirting with her, hitting on her. They realize she's a mutant. This scene and then she is attacked and violently beaten and killed by this mob. This story borrows aggressively from the sort of language and the social kind of contextual framing of something called a trans panic murder. And again, you can read more about this at WWAC, Women Write About Comics. Nola has really amazing articles on it that'll probably talk about it in more nuance and detail than I can really get into. But like, I understand and respect the fact that since writing it, Rosenberg has really done a lot of like deconstructing of what his intentions were and has reflected on the way that those intentions failed to be congruous with the way that the story was interpreted. That said, I don't think I've really met a lot of trans folks who didn't bounce off at that point. It is one of the most grotesque utilizations of the mutant metaphor to specifically tell a story that in no ambiguous way is trying to tell a story about trans panic murders, which are explicitly legal in 42 states of the United States. I think as of late 2020 or late 2021, that number has changed because it has been ruled unconstitutional in some state level circuits. But I didn't think to get those data points ahead of time, but it is a real thing. And Rosenberg borrows from this communal trauma. Like, trans people are already aware of this being a reality. We see it every day on social media. Like in 2020 alone, 8 trans people that we know of have been murdered under these circumstances. In 2020, 32 people were murdered under these circumstances. 2019, it was 25. Every year, more and more of us are being murdered in exactly this situation. And it's so callously and carelessly utilized in a comic that is already fairly grim and dire. And I understand and appreciate the fact that that was kind of an editorial mandate imposed on Rosenberg. Make this grim because Hoxpox is coming and we want that to feel really revelatory. We want that to feel really exciting and new. And it was kind of, Rosenberg was positioned to tell a grim story, but it was in such a way where, with us still having no real explicit representation on the page, our pain is being borrowed to tell a story, to sell issues of comics. And it's just done. There's no, and it does so by disempowering the character that this happens to. Rhayne is a former member of X-Force. Rhayne is a strong, combat-capable person who was overpowered by a group of drunk dudes. And so it does a disservice to the character itself. And I think that there are opportunities to tell a story about those real experiences of our community, but it was handled in such a way where it was like a sideshow version of what we go through, and it took all of the worst parts without constructing any critique of them, without constructing any sense of without having a real sense of the scope for what this is like for readers in real life. And it's probably not the only time that the mutant metaphor has failed, but it stands out to me as probably the most poignant because it's so poorly borrowed for something that trans readers regularly are faced with on a day-to-day basis and may have lived through themselves. Like, it doesn't always end in murder, but we are often attacked, and it was disappointing to see the mutant metaphor borrow so heavily from our experiences, but to do so in a way that was really just, it was making it a display and it was making it entertainment.
I want to say that just like I feel everything Dani said. And also when I read that issue, I really cried and I didn't learn anything from it. It was just suffering for the sake of suffering. It almost like pissed me off that the conclusion was like Wolverine getting revenge. That really pissed me off. Like it was just like to make some kind of fantastic revenge thing that is like from a Tarantino movie, and I didn't like that at all. Like it was, I don't know. I really was shook by it, and I still wonder to this day why that issue is still there, like in the paperback, like in the trade. Like why that wasn't like fixed later, because it really must deserve to know like keep getting published every time that book goes out again. And I was really liking the run until that point, which really like, I don't know, I was liking it for some reason, probably because of the Ed Brisson Cyclops story that was in the middle, and it really was emotional for me, and it took me like with the car off, and it was really like, reenacting that trauma, but not having like anything said about it that was really useful to me. Only like, this can happen to me any day. That's it. Like just that's all I get from this. And I really feel like if anyone with that experience was in any part of the process, like editorial, like in any, or just friends with someone with that experience, they could have stopped that. Because like, but and that's why we need sensitivity readers.
Yeah.
And it's also why we need more diverse creators. I mean, I don't think that creators should ever be discouraged, certainly, from writing about groups or identities to which they don't belong. And in that case, it's absolutely incumbent on them to use sensitivity readers and to make sure that they're aware of the way that their stories are going to be read and received. But that's also no excuse not to generate creative teams and staffs at comic companies that aren't going to rely on people who lack these identities to give them representation on the page. And if you have people writing about these characters who share their identities and who have experiences that they themselves have experienced as creators, then you're not going to run the same sort of risk that what should be powerful and personal instead just becomes a kind of prurient entertainment.
And I think that's, for me, what it boils down to a lot is that when it's these specified identities being kind of milked for that entertainment value is where it really fails for me. And like Dani said, I can understand and I can appreciate that Rosenberg probably had a very set mandate of making things grim and making things dark, but the way it was handled, both with Rhane's death and then several issues prior with Blindfold's death, for me, that was viscerally painful. This girl who they used the mutant metaphor about how hopeless the future is and how it never gets better and that this is forever. And all of those words and then the end result, sorry, again, trigger warning, with that end result of suicide and an unresolved suicide to this day, and for it to just happen and then for it to just get left there, and then for them to continue and poke that death as a means of motivating and a sign of Cyclops being a failure, when they put so much emotional focus on what Blindfold was feeling, that despair, that lack of hope, that this is forever, the words they kept using in that comic, it felt careless to me. And it used that mutant metaphor to speak about depression and ending in the worst possible way, and then for the sake of making the run dark. We do have a comment from Ali Galactic where it's talking about the difference between mutant metaphor being used well is good writers versus bad writers. And I want to take that a step further, and it's just I think it depends on the amount of effort that the person is putting it in. I think that a bad writer who utilizes sensitivity readers and utilizes research and utilizes feedback from the community that they're actually speaking of will tell a better story using the mutant metaphor than a good writer who is so convinced of their ability to pen a good story that they kind of trample over marginalized groups. And I'm not trying to badmouth what Rosenberg's process is, because I don't know what Rosenberg's process was. But I feel like it happens too often.
And that's the interesting thing, is up until that point, I mean, I still think on a technical level, I think Rosenberg is an incredibly talented writer. Rosenberg has an ability to construct framings for characters that really have a level of like energy and excitement and grounding that isn't very common. I mean, Hawkeye Freefall is like, I think it's really some of Rosenberg's best work. I mean, I also loved Rosenberg's New Mutants Dead Souls run. I think, and that's the thing, is Rosenberg is a very technically strong writer. It just comes down to the framing of not having thought through the impact of those experiences, which, you know, again, I, as somebody who's worked on the other side of the process on comics, movies, TV, novels, all kinds of things, like, I've seen the way a story can go from being really a nuanced articulation of the experiences of marginalized communities to being traumatic just based on framing. Like, when I give feedback to some people, sometimes it's as little as like, hey, just change a few words here or there, or like include this one line. And like, it really just takes simple aspects of reframing that could have, you know, really turned the Rosenberg debacle into an empowering story that demonstrates to the public the real experiences that this marginalized community goes through. But it lacked that switch of nuance being kind of flipped on by somebody. And I think, you know, it's to kind of also go back to the blindfold thing. It is a run that really sent a message home in the midst of one of the most like traumatic periods for a lot of people in our generation, like living through the Trump administration. Like, a lot of us probably thought it doesn't get better. And a lot of us probably didn't make it through. We all probably know folks who didn't make it through that administration. And it is so hurtful to like read a story where the metaphor is used to say it's only going to get harder. The way it feels now is only the way it can feel. And it deflates a sense of energy and optimism for what can happen and what can be lived, what can be beyond that pain. And it's a flaw of the metaphor, but I think it's one that is somewhat more avoidable if you're thinking through the impact of the stories that you're telling.
I think, if I can add on to that, I think it's a flaw of the metaphor, but much more than that, it's a flaw of the way that writers have very frequently misunderstood the metaphor. Because when X-Men's not working on a metaphoric level, I think it's because writers are presuming that the mutant metaphor functions as a metaphor for oppression to the extent that you sort of creatively revel in it, and it becomes a kind of trauma porn at its worst. Whereas the reality, when X-Men is working, and when X-Men historically has worked, it's about resistance in the face of oppression. It's about saying that we have formed this community of mutants because alone we will only be repetitive victims of trauma. But together, standing against this, we will not go down without fighting, and we will build something better because we are united against the oppression that they would seek to visit on us. That's the metaphor when it works. And I think when creators can understand that, and when they can have people who remind them of that, if they themselves haven't gone through experiences that would remind them of that, then I think it can function as something that really has enduring potential for the future.
Well, I think, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think this might be what brings back my problem with the metaphor, is it's not something that can ever be turned off. And I think that, like Dani was saying, the framing, like we have Ali in the comments talking about the use of resources, it could have changed how harmful the use of the metaphor was in these instances. But if there's the mandate that it needs to be a grim time for mutants, the metaphor can't be turned off, and it's going to read like a grim time for marginalized people. And I think there's always going to be some level of pain associated with that, because and maybe it's just me, I can't think of a way to shut off that metaphor. That when the mutants in Rosenberg's run are literally fighting for their lives and backed into a corner, and it's not a story about survival, it's a story about, we're already doomed, let's have this hit list of going through so we can do as much good before we're done. I don't know how that could be told in a way that's not full of despair for anyone who has kind of had that marginalized existence, because the mutant metaphor is so intrinsically tied to the X-Men that even when the writer isn't trying to consciously use it, it's still there. And I think I might have rambled halfway through that, but I hope I got my point across.
I think, for me, it feels like, whether you think Rosenberg is a strong writer or a weak writer or whatever, editorial was asleep. Editorial was so focused on the next event and the next relaunch or the next crossover that they let that whole storyline go on, and nobody just told him no. Back in the 60s, you had an artist, Werner Roth, who used to draw Banshee. He introduced Banshee, and he would draw Banshee with that ape face that they used to caricature Irish people with, where they've got the big philtrum like a chimp. And he was asked not to do that, and he kept doing it anyway. So eventually he gets fired. You don't really see him work in comics after that. That's should have happened a little sooner, in my opinion. Just fire him after the second issue of that. But I still see that today. We have artists who put anti-Semitic dog whistles into their art. We have artists who draw, alt-right characters in ways. There's that Storm special where they're in Storm's mind and everything is African Velt, because apparently that's Storm's life. She's lived in New York, all that we've been reading her, but that's her life. But Jean Grey makes that big red elephant with her telekinesis. We have never seen Jean Grey make a big red animal of any kind in 40-something years, longer than that, 60 years now. But because she's in a Black woman's mind, the first thing she thinks of to make with her telekinesis is a big red elephant. I would be so pissed off at my friend if my friend did something, not that my friends have telekinesis, but, these sort of things are things that the editors should be telling them, don't do that. And it's something that when you talk to Wheezy or Annie Nocenti, or you read their interviews or read their, that they told people when they were editors no, that they were willing to tell Chris Claremont no, or they were willing to tell John Byrne no. And that's what they need. They need editors to come in and say, this reads poorly. This is a superhero comic. A big part of my problem with the Rhayne thing is that it's a superhero comic first and foremost. And so if you're not being superheroic, why are you even here? Go write something else, go do something else. And all the, I wanted to tell a meaningful thing or I wanted to reach, it doesn't matter to me at that point. You're writing an all ages superhero comic. So for me, it starts and stops with the editors, but I think the writers become the most obvious when they slip up, but they may be writing something that's a sign. Artists can change things so much. I was reading a comic earlier this morning, and the story is written trying to be very sensitive. It's a female protagonist, and she's trying to figure out why she's attracted to a guy who's a jerk, who's her partner. And the way that it's drawn is she's constantly bending over. And at one point, she has a bunch of white milky stuff on her face that I can't tell comes from anywhere. Like, I don't know. Like, it's not in the story. And so the colorist and the artist were just like, I'm going to draw porn and the colorist is going to color porn. And the writer's trying to tell a different story. I really love the Bendis X-Men for the most part. But like when Chris Bachalo is the artist, and I think, Chris is brilliant many times, but he is so into showing teenage girls bend over in short skirts in that run that I can't, I just can't get with it. That sort of thing throws me out. That's something an editor can just say, Chris, you're like 50 years old. You can stop drawing 16-year-olds bending over now. We're having some of those artists make comebacks right now, even though they're affiliated with, Comicsgate and hate groups. Why are X-Men Comics specifically hiring artists? And I don't care that they were famous 20, 30 years ago. Why are X-Men Comics hiring artists who are affiliated with hate groups, who have publicly harassed and shamed people who come from other communities, non-white people, trans people? That they need to be accountable for these things. Sorry about that. I thought on that.
You said it. If anyone wants to add anything over what Travis said.
I think Travis hit all the most important parts there. I don't think I can add anything to that.
Okay, so before we finish, I really wanna, because there are some questions that couldn't be covered because we have too much to talk about the other ones, and I totally get it. But I really wanna ask every one of you for a comic, a run, a character, wherever, that you feel like you approach different because of your identity, and that you feel that people can win something out of that, or can, that like you would recommend. And I don't know who wants to go first. That would be my final question. Like,
I can start because I feel like I'm always talking about this comic. I would say Vita Ayala's current run of New Mutants, amazing run in general, but specifically issue 15 into 16, the story being told right now with Danny Moonstar and Cosmar is really. It is a really wonderful story that I think unearths so much of the complexity experienced by folks within the trans community and the trans and gender variant community more broadly regarding the navigation of bodily autonomy, body politics, the way we navigate dysphoria, the way that trans medicalism has been internalized into our community. I think it's an excellent way to introduce these concepts using the metaphor. And I think it's probably, Vita is telling a story that I'm comfortable saying I don't think has really an equal in terms of capturing this aspect of how the mutant metaphor can interface with the sort of politicized nature of trans bodies. And I think they're just firing on cylinders that I didn't even know could exist within the X-Men comics and within the mutant metaphor. And I think it's an excellent run, and it's also going to teach you a lot about the trans experience if you are unfamiliar.
So for me, Joe Duffy and Carrie Gamble's Fallen Angels from the 1980s, that hit so many points for me growing up poor, growing up marginalized, because it starts out with the New Mutants, and they are playing soccer and they get in a fight, and that fight very quickly has racial overtones. And Roberto feels that he is being, pressed upon by his white friends, basically. And that motivates him to leave and meet these other characters who are also ethnically diverse, but they're all coming from much harsher backgrounds than many of the New Mutants characters, specifically economically and in terms of having housing and provisions. And there's a lot of trauma in those characters. Some of the characters don't ever understand in the comic that they have mental illnesses or that they have depression, not because of like a chemical depression, but situational depression. Some of those characters, there's one character who is named Gomi, and he's like, he loves that name, and that's what his brother called him and all this, and it means trash. And they were just messing with him. The adults in his life, the older kids in his life were just bad to him, and he doesn't ever understand that, but we can understand it. And the characters that are around him understand it. And so that, for me, really spoke to me as a kid, and I think can still speak to a lot of people, that even if you don't understand everything about yourself, that your community can lift you up, that you can participate as a community together.
I'll go. For me, and it's so disjointed, but the entirety of Monet and Implate's relationship throughout Generation X, even starting with the Phalanx Covenant, it's something that I kind of just took in as my own. This complex family story, this Brown family, this family that even decades later, I don't feel like I'm as eloquent. I can put this as eloquently as you guys have, but I feel like that's a well-written story about a family of color in an X-Men comic that their race hasn't been at the forefront. It wasn't like Riri Williams' dad being shot in a drive-by, and then that's her origin story. This is a family of mutants that, though the shine and the appearance on panels hasn't always been as expansive as other families, this is a family of brown people, I feel like, presented in a very good way, or very non-stereotypical way. And that would be, I'm not sure how that's collected, or if you just have to read all of Generation X and then hop onto other books, but I feel like that run right when she was a teenager, Implate showing up and then figuring out the secret of M and her siblings, to me that's the best written mutant or even Marvel story that I've seen of a brown family that hasn't been rooted in trauma that was real world stereotypes of trauma. Like the trauma they had was basically from the powers that were created in the book. So I think that family's run through Generation X is what I would say. Look at that.
I can go next because it's an episode of Mutant Watch where I haven't ranted about Richter nearly enough, so I might as well do that now. I mentioned him earlier with X Factor and how he dealt with depression, and suicide attempt and him coming out and what that meant to me. But one thing about Richter that always got me is the consistency of Richter needing therapy. Richter has a life of trauma, and he has a life of horrible things happening to him. And he consistently throughout the comics, both in X Factor and in Excalibur now by Tini Howard, where he's just grasping at straws, trying to find the best possible option out of all of his shitty options. And how that frequently involves him getting tied up with people he shouldn't be tied up with. His loyalty to Apocalypse, his loyalty to Pietro, his questionable way of trying to get back his power and then getting back his power, and that whole journey. It's a continuous narrative of Richter surviving. Surviving despite his loss, his dad being killed in front of him, survival despite his depression, which, aside from the suicide attempt, may never have been explicit, but it's always there, even down to, if you look at the way he's drawn in X Factor, he looks like he's someone with depression. And just that continuous narrative of him surviving, and it's one of the few instances where I like that it's not really been the hugest focus. It's just an aspect of who he is. Richter is a mutant. Richter is Mexican. Richter is queer. Richter has depression, and his story continues from there.
So, no surprise to anyone, I think, if I say that the character to whom I always connected most right from the beginning is Magneto. And not only because he is one of the two most prominent, and there aren't a lot of Jewish characters in Marvel Comics and in the X-Men, but because he embodies a reckoning with that Judaism and with his mutanthood that represents a constructive rebellion against the constraints of society. In recent runs, I think that Cullen Bunn did a very good job in his Magneto series of working through the strengths and virtues and moral compromises inherent in that kind of radically militant form of mutant identity. And long before that, I think in a grand total of 20 pages, Chris Claremont summarized his view of the character, who he really reinvented with two backup stories in Classic X-Men. The first of them is in Classic X-Men number 12, which is the first time that we see on page Magneto's history as a victim of the Holocaust and someone who was sent to the death camps at Auschwitz and survived. And out of that survival and out of the subsequent overt oppression that was inflicted on him by society and inflicted against his family to ultimately take the life of his child, he built a new vision as somebody who was never going to allow this to happen again. It is the ethos of never forgetting turned into the ethos of building a better society so that this won't happen to you, it won't happen to your people, and it won't happen to any other people against whom society would take these actions. And the second of those is Classic X-Men number 19, which tells the story of how he attempted to work with established governments to hunt down former Nazi war criminals, only to learn that he was associated with Operation Paperclip, attempting to actually recruit the quote-unquote good Nazis to work for governments who could find their skills useful. And from that lesson understood that he had to build something independently. He could not do as his rival Charles Xavier does, and attempt to work within the confines of the established order, because the established order will always betray you in the end for the sake of their own interest. This is not the only outlook in X-Men comics, but it's an outlook that, for very obvious reasons, I found personal and compelling and flatly more convincing than the alternative. And so those stories have always connected with me in in a way that I don't think is going to disappear anytime soon.
Damn, that was great. I note them down. I'm gonna read them after we finish the show. Because I haven't read a lot of the classic X-Men issues. So, wow. Thank you. Thank you all for the examples. Also, Ali in the comments said X-Men 7, which is the issue of Arrow's Crucible. And they didn't explain why, but but yes, that it was very emotional for them. So that's great.
So I don't know if Dani might be able to elaborate, because I know that Ali says that you guys had discussions about this, but I've also seen some of Ali's Twitter threads, and if I'm understanding it correctly, what makes it so pregnant is the kind of self authority advocacy that or Arrow has, and able to make those choices for herself. That is something that she wants to live her authentic self, and the Crucible is this way of her reaching that self that she knows who she is inside, even if her abilities and her outside doesn't match that. She's able to make it happen. And if I'm understanding correctly what I've read from Ali on Twitter, I think that might be why it might stick out to her, and why it sticks out to me as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to use this opportunity to try to bully Ali into writing about it, because she absolutely should write about it. So Ali, please.
Write about it.
Yeah. But I also
want to read it.
Yes. I think it also, and I'll try to be succinct because we're here at the end. I think another aspect of it that's so important about that issue is Crucible from the outside looks absurd, it looks violent, it looks gladiatorial. There are panels where all of the Guthries are there. Husk is literally pulling her own skin off, watching Arrow get beaten up by Apocalypse, and it looks like this violent display from the outside. And one of the things that really captures about a lot of the experiences trans people feel is a lot. I mean, we've all heard it from somebody in our lives. Wouldn't you rather just have it be easier for yourself? Why are you doing all of these things to your body? Wouldn't it just be easier to accept where you are? Wouldn't it be easier for Arrow to just accept being a human and not go through all this suffering? But what people might see as a violent process from outside, for us, is something truly beautiful. And we're like, I've always described it as like, when I transitioned, I was killing parts of myself off in the most beautiful way imaginable. I was burying somebody that I thought I had to accept being. And every time I did something for myself, every punch that Arrow takes, it is bringing us one step closer to who we are, it's almost like, Apocalypse is beating the layers of somebody else away to reveal Arrow anew. And I think, I've heard Ali spit some insanely wise facts about just what that. And I think if you go back to Vox Krakoa episode 10 or 11, you can hear Ali and I talk a little bit about this. But that experience really captures something really deeply personal to a lot of trans folks whose transitions might have been really hard to manage in their own, social circles. And I think that's probably what Ali might be getting at.
And Ali, actually, back into the comments, she did pull a line from that issue. And that is when Apocalypse says to Arrow, "I see you, sister. We all do."
So I might want to connect that with my recommendation. Mine is it's pretty old for what we are. It's New Mutants, the old run of New Mutants. Although I would agree with Dani that this one is very promising, so it might just win. But the issues that when Louis Simonson started writing, which is around 55, until Inferno. And it's for a very, very similar reason to Ali, because in Inferno, oh, spoilers, Iliana chooses to save herself as a child and live her whole life again as a child, which is not something that is possible in the real world. But it really struck me as both someone who has a lot of trauma associated with childhood, a lot of traumatic events that I wish hadn't have happened, and also as a trans person who has lived most of my life without having anything to do about it. And it really, really was strong for me in the way that Iliana just like chose that, even if everyone else told her she couldn't choose that anyway. And that's what really, like, everyone is saying Destiny, Dani, even Rhayne, even if Rhayne at the end like bonds with Iliana about it, they're all telling her that she might cause chaos by liberating that part of her. And at the end, what she does is just like not only keep Inferno from invading the Earth, but also give her own self as a child the possibility of living something different, which is something that is really beautiful to me, even if it doesn't have like a real life thing to it. So that would be mine. And before we close, well, I want to thank you all for coming here and for talking about all these things. I'm really happy with what you all talk about, and really gonna note down some stuff and probably watch this later again. And for real, thank you all so much. And in the next show, we're gonna talk about New Mutants, the old run. So that's in topic with what I just talked about. And we will announce it sometime soon. And thanks for Ali for those comments, for Real, and for the people watching, and for you all three. Please follow Dani, follow Zach, follow Rhayne in the handlers that are right there. And see you all later.